In this video we will review some facts about New York. But before we start, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for future updates. The whole state of New York is overshadowed by its most renowned city, New York City. However, New York State has a rich history and numerous contemporary events that you should be aware of. Discover more about New York State with these 70 facts. The terrain of New York State is distinct. Most people believe that densely populated metropolitan regions dominate the landscape of the state. This is hardly surprising given that the association originates from the state's most famous metropolis, New York. Outside of the towns, however, the state features a remarkably beautiful scenery with woods, lakes, meadows, mountains, and even rivers. The Allegheny Plateau encompasses the majority of the state's southern region and rises to meet the Catskill Mountains' southern tier. The state's northeast is dominated by the Great Appalachian Valley, while the state's southeast is dominated by the Hudson Valley. Finally, the Marcellus Shale, which stretches west to Ohio and Pennsylvania, underpins the rest of the state. The state's territory includes a number of bodies of water and island groupings. The Hudson River, which rises in the Adirondack Mountains and travels across the state's eastern half before emptying into Upper New York Bay, is one of them. There are also Lakes Erie and Ontario, as well as the Niagara and St. Lawrence rivers. In terms of islands, Manhattan Island is the most significant in the state, followed by Staten Island and Long Island. In reality, these three islands are shared by 4 of the 5 boroughs that comprise New York City. Given the archipelago's position on the St. Lawrence River, New York State also shares the Thousand Islands archipelago with the Canadian province of Ontario. Its highest peak is Mount Marcy. Mount Marcy is a mountain in Essex County, New York, that rises to a height of 1.63 kilometers. This height was a factor in its Native American names, Tawarestha, Mohawkfa, it pierces, and Tahorus, Algonquin for cloud piercer. In contrast, its English name is derived from William Marcy, the governor of New York State from 1833 to 1838. He received this accolade after organizing a reconnaissance of the surrounding area, which resulted in a team of climbers reaching the mountain's peak in August 1837. When then Vice President Teddy Roosevelt went hunting on its slopes, the mountain became part of American history. Messages arrived in the middle of the hunt alerting him of the killing of U.S. President William McKinley. This compelled Roosevelt to travel to Washington, D.C., where he was sworn in as the new President of the United States. New York State has a fairly consistent climate. Specifically, a humid continental climate with warm summers and lengthy, frigid winters. New York City, on the other hand, is a minor outlier within the state, having a humid subtropical climate. As a result, the city and its environs have hot and humid summers as well as chilly and damp winters. This discrepancy is attributed to the city's proximity to the Atlantic Ocean, which boosts humidity in the air. Temperatures in the state often range between 23 and 28 degrees Celsius in the summer and 15 to 25 degrees below zero in the winter. The state receives an estimated 1.5 meters of rain per year on average. Climate change has emerged as a key concern in the state. Scientists have discovered that average temperatures in New York State have risen by 3 degrees Celsius during the previous century. Based on present patterns in global greenhouse gas emissions, they anticipate that temperatures will climb by another 9 degrees by 2080. They also anticipate that the state will have a humid subtropical climate by that time. Rising sea levels as a result of melting Arctic and Antarctic ice due to global warming are likewise a serious issue. Scientists project that by 2080, sea levels in the state would have risen by more than a meter, causing billions of dollars in property damage. Furthermore, they anticipate that the same rise in sea levels will fully drown the Southampton Barrier Islands. The state's environment is remarkably diversified. Over 20 bird and mammal species, as well as other amphibian and reptile species, call New York State home. Bobcats, coyotes, groundhogs, moose, muskrats, raccoons, and even turkeys are among the animals. Bald eagles, harriers, and kestrels are among the many birds of prey that dwell in the state. Waterfowl such as mallards and shorebirds such as killdeers may also be found throughout the state. The state is home to numerous different types of vegetation in addition to animals. American ginseng, common nettle, eastern poison ivy, gigantic hogweed, and water thyme are among them. It also contains a variety of state parks. In reality, New York State contains the country's oldest state park, Niagara Falls State Park, which was founded in 1885 as the Niagara Reservation. The state also boasts the largest state park in the United States, the Adirondack Park, which covers an area larger than the state of Vermont. The park also contains over 100 towns and villages, with a permanent population of over 132,000 people. As a result, it has acquired the distinction of being the greatest experiment in merging human lifestyles with conservation initiatives. Other parks in the state include Catskill Park and Hither Hills State Park, which is popular with the sports fishing community. The state is home to some of the most recognizable memorials in the United States. The Statue of Liberty, which stands on Ellis Island in New York Harbor, is the most famous of them all. The statue was designed and erected in France, and it was given to the United States in 1886 to honor 100 years of American freedom. No other monument has become more symbolic not just of the United States, but also of freedom and democracy. The General Grant National Memorial, based around the tomb of U.S. President and former Union General Ulysses Grant, is another monument in the state. The aforementioned mausoleum is not only the largest among those belonging to departed U.S. presidents, but it is also the largest mausoleum in all of North America. It is also the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt National Historic Site in Hyde Park, which protects the former president's estate. Before Europeans arrived, many Native American tribes resided in what would become New York State. The dominating tribes were the Haudenosaunee and the Algonquins, who shared the majority of the territory. Other tribes included the Wampanoags and the Lenape, who partitioned Long Island in the same way. The Mohicans, as well as the Iroquois, Petun, Susquehannocks, and Erie, inhabited in the area. During King Philip's War between 1675 and 1678, most of these tribes banded together under the leadership of Wampanoag King Metacome to try to remove the Europeans. The Mohawks, in particular, were very hostile to Europeans, and they even discriminated against Native Americans who converted to Christianity. The death of Metacome resulted in their loss and eventual banishment from the region. During the colonial period, Native Americans battled each other. The Mohawks, in particular, waged conquest battles against the Abenaki and Mohicans. Similarly, in the 17th century, the Susquehannocks defeated the Lenape. The Beaver Wars, on the other hand, were the deadliest and longest struggle between Native Americans and Europeans. The Iroquois battled against the other tribes in order to drive them out of the area and control the fur trade with Europeans. They had the backing of the Dutch, who sought to control the fur trade in North America as well. Other tribes had French backing, but the Iroquois ruled New England during the 17th century. A Dutch setback to the British in Europe temporarily weakened the Iroquois, only for the British to quickly ally with them. The French loss in the 7 Years' War effectively ended French backing to the other tribes, ensuring Iroquois supremacy in the region. During the 16th century, Europeans began proper colonization of the area. It all began in 1540, with French traders establishing an outpost on Castle Island. Ironically, they were forced to evacuate the outpost after rains devastated it the next year. Although they established subsequent outposts, the original stronghold remained abandoned until 1640, when it was reconstructed as Fort Nassau by the Dutch. Fort Nassau existed until 1623, when it was abandoned by the Dutch in favor of Fort Orange. Fort Orange was followed by other outposts in villages like Asbeverbeck, Fort Amsterdam, and Esopus. Ironically, the Dutch did not travel to North America to occupy it, but rather to discover the Northwest Passage to the Pacific. The lucrative North American fur trade, however, led the Dutch to reconsider their attitude. The Northwest Passage was impassable by ship until the 19th century with the advent of early modern icebreaker technology. In the 17th century, the British took control of the region. It began with the Second Anglo-Dutch War, which lasted from 1665 to 1667, with the British battling to dethrone the Dutch as the dominant European economic and naval power. Despite losing that war, Britain was able to maintain its gains in North America at the peace table. This prompted them to unite the region's villages into the province of New York, giving rise to the contemporary name. The Third Anglo-Dutch War, which lasted from 1672 to 1674, saw the French allied with the British. The Dutch reclaimed the province of New York in 1673, but although winning the war again, were forced to hand up the province to the British in the Treaty of Westminster in 1674. The 1760s witnessed the start of the revolt against British control. It all began in New York City in 1765, with the founding of the Sons of Liberty Group. The association was created in reaction to the Stamp Act, which mandated that all printed goods in British North America utilize specially stamped paper manufactured in the United Kingdom. To show a united front against the Stamp Act, they and other opposing parties organized the Stamp Act Congress. They were successful, with the British Parliament overturning the unpopular statute and the Congress and its members disbanding shortly thereafter. However, in doing so, they established a precedent for collective action in response to perceived injustices caused by British control. The Stamp Act Congress, in particular, influenced the Continental Congress, which declared American independence from Britain during the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, many significant engagements took place in New York State. In May 1775, the Patriots captured Fort Ticonderoga, taking the fort's guns before reinforcing their fellow revolutionaries in Boston. The British had encircled the city at the time, but the arrival of fresh revolutionary forces armed with heavy artillery caused them to flee. In August 1776, the British defeated the Americans and captured New York City at the Battle of Long Island. For the duration of the war, the city served as the primary British operating base. Ironically, since the city's inhabitants remained strongly anti-British and pro-independence, they were exposed to American espionage activities. The fall of New York City did not, however, put a stop to American military operations in the region, with the American triumph at Saratoga in 1777 spurring France to publicly support American independence and even declare war on Britain. During the conflict, the Iroquois Native Americans were divided. The majority of the Iroquois in New York State backed the British, having formed an alliance with them long before the American Revolution. They also feared that if the British were defeated, the Americans would grab their territories or compel them to submit. After the conflict, the Iroquois lost most of their territories, with those clans believed to have fought for Britain being banished to Canada. Only by fighting alongside the revolutionary armies were some Iroquois able to remain in the region. These tribes received federal recognition for their territories as well as the right to self-government. This ultimately resulted in a series of litigation in the late 20th century, as current Iroquois fought for the right to reclaim territories that had formerly belonged to their people. Following the war, New York City became the United States' first capital. In 1777, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union established New York City to be the nation's capital. Even when the United States reformed its administration in accordance with the newly created United States Constitution, New York City remained the capital. New York became the 11th state to ratify the United States Constitution. It also housed New York City, where George Washington took his oath as the first President of the United States. In that city, the U.S. government also wrote the Bill of Rights and held the first sessions of the U.S. Supreme Court. It wasn't until 1790, when the government relocated to Philadelphia, and again in 1800, when it relocated to Washington, D.C., that New York City lost its title as the capital city of the United States. Until 1827, slavery was allowed in New York State. It may be traced back to the early days of European colonialism, when the Dutch imported African slaves as inexpensive labor. Under British authority, the practice remained and even expanded, with slaves being utilized in rural regions. Even in cities, though, most households had at least one or two slaves. Indeed, at the time of the American Revolution, New York State had the second largest slave population of the 13 colonies. Fortunately, soon after the American Revolution, the state government approved a statute demanding the progressive elimination of slavery in the state. Even then, it would take until 1827 for the last slave in New York State to be emancipated. During the early 19th century, New York State's infrastructure flourished. The sheer volume of traffic between the countryside and the state's major towns quickly overwhelmed the rural roadways. This resulted in the development of different canals, beginning with the Erie Canal in 1817. It was completed in 1825 and connected Lake Erie to the Hudson River, allowing marine access to New York City. Other canals followed, but by the 1850s, railways had become more vital in connecting New York State with other New England states as well as the Midwest. The state's ports were also expanding rapidly at the period, with cotton arriving by sea from the southern states. The finished items are then returned in the same manner or shipped to European markets. During the American Civil War, New York State remained loyal to the Union. The state supplied an estimated 400,000 men to the Union war effort, with an estimated 54,000 dying in the process. These soldiers were divided into 248 infantry regiments, 27 cavalry regiments, 15 artillery regiments, and 8 engineering regiments. The 20th, 26th, and 31st regiments also distinguished themselves as United States Colored Troops, USCT. They got their name from the fact that the majority of their men were African Americans and other minorities. Aside from soldiers, New York State's heavy industry was crucial to the Union war effort. In addition to guns and ammunition, the state's factories supplied the Union Army with clothing, tools, and even train cars and locomotives. The state also supplied much of the food for the Army, with New York's farms ranking among the most productive in the United States at the time. The well-developed transportation systems in New York also allowed men and supplies to reach the front lines in time to make a difference. State politics were complicated during the Civil War. Ironically, at the time, New York City Mayor Fernando Wood openly supported the Confederacy. He even attempted to persuade the rest of the city government, as well as the rest of New York State, to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. During the war, former New York Governor Horatio Seymour also occupied a middle ground. On the one hand, he condemned secession and backed the war against the Confederacy. On the other hand, he criticized the Union Army's harsh tactics, such as General Sherman's scorched earth campaign in the American South. He also chastised U.S. President Abraham Lincoln for restricting civil liberties during the war. Roscoe Conkling, on the other hand, strongly supported the war effort, including the Union Army's total war doctrine of crushing the Confederacy with overwhelming force. Even President Lincoln's pre-war critic, William Seward, ceased his criticism during the war in the interest of unity, and the president rewarded him by appointing Seward as U.S. Secretary of State. Riots erupted in the state over Civil War conscription. On July 11, 1863, thousands of pro-Confederate Irish Americans rioted in New York City against conscription. The rioters tortured and killed any African Americans they found, with death usually in form of hanging or burning alive. They also attacked the homes of the wealthy, as well as anyone they thought supported the Union. The violence forced President Lincoln to send in federal troops to restore order in the city. In the end, only 120 people died in the riots, but another 2,000 people suffered various injuries. The property losses amounted to an estimated $1 million, and the draft found itself suspended while the government refined its procedure further. It would take until August later that year for the draft to return to New York State. Various Civil War memorials stand in the state today. There's the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch in Brooklyn, raised by the Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, after the war. A group composed completely of Union Army veterans, the GAR also raised a women's memorial at the New York State Capitol in Albany. Other memorials include the Greenwood Cemetery, which has the graves of hundreds of Union veterans. New York State also has the West Point Cemetery, which has the graves of various Union generals, such as George Custer and Wesley Merritt. The state also has a memorial at Elmira, which maintained a prison camp during the Civil War. Of the Confederate prisoners kept there, an estimated 2,000 Confederates died before the war's end. Their graves lie nearby at the Woodlawn National Cemetery. New York State became a major destination for immigrants in the 19th century. In fact, even before the Civil War, the state's various ports made it a natural entry point for immigrants to the USA. At the time, the federal government made it a policy to allow state governments to decide their individual approaches to immigration. This led New York State to form a board of commissioners to regulate immigration through the state. This also led to the construction of Castle Garden on what would become Battery Park, where immigrants would wait until they finished immigration procedures. Castle Garden stayed in use until 1890 when the federal government took control of immigration across the nation as a whole. In that time, an estimated 8 million immigrants passed through Castle Garden into the USA. Under the federal government, immigrants waited at Ellis Island instead, with an estimated 12 million immigrants passing through it until 1954. In that year, the U.S. government stopped using the island to process immigrants, with the state government building an immigration memorial on the island afterward. New York State enjoyed widespread political influence in the early 20th century. By 1900, New York State was the richest and most populated state in the USA. New York City, in particular, became symbolic of American success and world leadership to the Great Depression. It also became the centerpiece of the progressive movement, especially under Republican President Teddy Roosevelt. The state as a whole became symbolic of Republican administration's efforts to fight business monopolies, called trusts, at the time. Similarly, the Democrats fought to increase public involvement in the government and to increase the power of labor unions. Ironically, New York State became infamous at this time for Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party's headquarters in the state. Tammany Hall's leaders strongly opposed giving women the right to vote, earning themselves a poor place in history. The Great Depression hit the state hard. For one thing, the Great Depression started in New York State, with the Wall Street crash on Black Tuesday. Specifically, October 29, 1929, a day which started like any other before it, but is when the stock market had suffered 11% losses. These losses would only grow worse over the following years, as the U.S. economy practically collapsed, dragging the rest of the world economy with it. By 1931, New York State suffered an estimated unemployment rate of 25%. State Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt managed to halt the collapse with large-scale public works programs. These gave people jobs that allowed them to earn a living wage, while also stimulating the economy. His success in New York State allowed him to launch a successful presidential campaign in 1932. And once elected as President of the USA, Roosevelt would apply that same strategy across the USA to revive the economy. New York State was a major player in the U.S. war effort in World War II. For one thing, the state had the single largest port the USA had on the Atlantic Ocean, New York City. This made both the city and the state the natural departure point for supplies and men headed to Europe. The state's industries also made significant contributions to the war, with 11% of all the ammo the U.S. military used coming from factories in New York State. An estimated 31,000 New Yorkers also fought and died in either Europe or the Pacific during the war. This also inspired the state government to pass a law in 1944 offering college scholarships for soldiers returning from the war. Even before that, in 1941 the state formed the Committee on Discrimination in Employment. As implied in its name, the committee worked to address discriminatory issues in workplaces at the time. However, they didn't have social justice in mind, as much as factories not working at their best due to not having enough people to work because their managers didn't want to hire colored people. The state fell into decline after the war. The end of the war saw the armaments industry shrink, which hurt the state economy. Service industries grew to fill the gap, but this left skilled workers with experience only in industry unemployed. Industrial companies instead moved to other states, with the workers moving to follow in their wake. Ironically, even as the state population shrank, the middle class also grew, with suburbs growing with them. New York State's population decline finally stopped in the 1980s. By that time, both society and the economy had managed to adapt to the changing times. This, in turn, brought an end to New York State's decades-long period of decline. New York State gained tragic fame as a result of the 9/11 attacks in 2001. On September 11, 2001, Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 planes flying on domestic routes in the USA. One of the planes saw the passengers fight back, and while they failed to retake the plane, they managed to force a crash instead of letting the terrorists fly the plane into the White House. One of the other 3 planes flew into the Pentagon, while the other 2 planes flew into the World Trade Center. Composed of twin skyscrapers, each building found itself hit by 1 plane each. Everyone inside the planes died on impact, which seriously damaged both buildings and started massive fires. Despite hours of desperate efforts to save the buildings, the World Trade Center collapsed from the damage. An estimated 3,000 people died, while another estimated 25,000 people suffered various injuries. With Al-Qaeda publicly claiming responsibility for the attacks, the USA responded by invading Afghanistan, which served as the terrorists' home base. This also marked the beginning of the ongoing global conflict known as the War on Terror. Hurricane Sandy later devastated the state in 2012. The hurricane made landfall on October 29 of that year and continued to affect the state until October 30. The sheer amount of rainfall that the hurricane brought flooded subway and road tunnels across the state. For safety reasons, the state had to cut power to the hardest-hit areas, in particular, New York City and its suburbs. Together with the hurricane's other consequences, this led the New York Stock Exchange to shut down for 2 days straight. Thankfully, only 53 individuals died, but thousands of houses and properties were devastated. Damages caused by the hurricane amounted to an estimated $19 billion. This is in addition to an anticipated $33 billion in post-storm repairs. COVID-19 wreaked havoc on the state in 2020. The first instances of the sickness appeared in New York State in March of that year, and by the end of the month, the state had the most cases in the whole United States. In fact, by April 2020, New York State had more instances than any other country. As a result, the state administration imposed a lockdown to try to contain the spread of the disease. By June, the state administration had largely lifted the lockdown due to a decrease in the number of new cases. The state administration and conservative organizations clashed as a result of the lockdown. The restriction of indoor religious meetings to only 25% of maximum capacity. This resulted in a July court hearing in which the state was found to have violated religious freedom by limiting indoor religious meetings. Despite this setback, the state's lockdown efforts resulted in New York State having the fewest new cases in the United States by September of 2020. Albany, the state capital, dates back to the late 17th century. In 1609, Henry Hudson of the Dutch East India Company claimed the territory on which the city presently lies for the Netherlands. The erection of Fort Nassau in 1614 marked the establishment of the first permanent European settlement in what would become Albany. The Dutch also restored and renamed Fort Orange, a wrecked French fort on Castle Island. Both forts were named after the Dutch royal family, the House of Orange-Nassau. The colonial population had increased to the extent that a governmental restructuring was required by 1652. As a result, Fort Orange and the surrounding community became part of the village of Beverwijk. This translates as Beaver District in English, referring to the region's economic reliance on the trading of beaver fur. In 1664, the city was given its contemporary name. This was due to the British invasion of the island during the Second Anglo-Dutch War. The British nicknamed the settlement Albany to honor their victory. The new name was given in honor of the Duke of Albany, who went on to become King James II of England and King James VI of Scotland. During the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1673, the Dutch retook the village and renamed it Willemstad. However, once the British reclaimed the then province of New York following the war, Willemstad was renamed Albany in English. The settlement's size and population grew slowly throughout this period, with Albany having a population of barely 500 at the end of the 16th century. It was also well known throughout the Revolution and the early post-revolutionary period. This was due, ironically, to the fact that no fighting occurred in or around Albany during the American Revolution. Land values increased due to the area's tranquil reputation and absence of conflict damage. This, in turn, attracted more settlers following the war's end, resulting in fast population expansion. The inflow of capital into the local economy also contributed to the area's expansion. Albany shared its role as state capital with other cities during the period, as the state government traveled back and forth. Other cities on the list were New York City, Hurley, Kingston, and Poughkeepsie. Albany did not become the permanent state capital of New York until 1797. In the 19th century, Albany grew into a significant transportation center. It all started in 1800 with the development of a toll road, or turnpike, with Albany being the heart of the state road network by 1815. The state also boasted the world's first steamboat line, which ran from Albany and New York City in 1807. The Erie Canal, built in 1825, also went through Albany, connecting the city to the Great Lakes. Railroads expanded out to and from the city as well, with a total of 10 constructed between the 1830s and the 1850s. Albany became a significant transportation center to and from New England and the Midwest as a result of roads, canals, and railways. Following World War II, the fortunes of the city varied. On the one hand, the city's economy was steady during the 1950s and 1960s. It also avoided the urban degradation that afflicted other European towns at the period. However, the city's population fell precipitously throughout those decades, with an estimated 20% of the inhabitants relocating elsewhere. With an increase in employment, Governor Nelson Rockefeller's large-scale public works program helped revitalize the city's fortunes. Unfortunately, it also resulted in a succession of obligations that took the state till 2004 to pay off. The new infrastructure also denied the city direct access to the Hudson River, which is now considered unproductive. Nonetheless, the initiative witnessed the preservation and renovation of several historic structures and buildings. Albany hosts a number of festivals on a regular basis. Every Thursday, the city hosts a free music series called Alive at 5 in the downtown area. Every year, these performances are attended by an estimated 100,000 people. In recognition of its Dutch roots, Albany also hosts an annual Tulip Festival in Washington Park. The event is held in May, to coincide with the blossoming of the park's thousands of tulip blossoms. Albany also has an annual Pride Parade and festival in June to support the LGBTQ community. Naturally, Albany celebrates Independence Day on July 4, outdoing even New York City in terms of the greatest fireworks show in the state. The people of New York State are varied. Whites constitute a slim majority of the state's population, accounting for 55% of the total. With 13% of the white population, Italian Americans are the biggest group. Hispanics are in second position overall, accounting up an estimated 20% of the state's population, followed by African Americans at 15%. Puerto Ricans account for the majority of the Hispanic population, accounting for around 6%. Asian Americans account for an estimated 11% of the state's population, while other ethnicities account for an estimated 3%. In fact, New York State boasts the nation's second largest Asian American population behind California. It also boasts the country's fourth largest African American population. The same is true for the faiths of the state. At 60%, the state's population adheres to various Christian denominations. Roman Catholics account up the majority of the Christian population, accounting for an estimated 31%. Protestants account for 26% of all Christians, with Eastern Orthodox and other religions accounting for the remaining 3%. Aside from Christianity, an estimated 7% of New Yorkers practice Judaism, with the state having the biggest Jewish population outside of Israel. Muslims account up at least 2% of the state's population, whereas other religions account for only 3%. However, a fairly substantial proportion of the state's population, 27%, identifies as unaffiliated with any religion. New York State is friendly to the LGBTQ community. With an estimated 600,000 persons identifying as LGBTQ, the LGBTQ community accounts for 4% of the state's population. There are an estimated 50,000 same-sex couples in the state. Today, same-sex weddings are anticipated to bring $259 million to the state economy. These include both same-sex citizens and visitors from other states who have come to marry in the state. In 2011, New York State became the fifth state to accept same-sex marriages. New York City shares the largest annual Pride Parade in the world with São Paulo, Brazil. The state's LGBTQ community has also expressed support for minority rights, as seen by a parade in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. The Stonewall riots of 1969 occurred in New York State. They erupted on June 28, 1969, and continued until July 3, 1969, in response to a police raid at the Stonewall Inn. The cops attempted to arrest all homosexual clients there. Instead, their arrogant demeanor infuriated both customers and onlookers around. They also abused several of the present lesbians, provoking much more uproar. The police called in reinforcements, but when they came, a throng formed outside the inn to oppose their conduct. When the cops publicly assaulted a lesbian, the mob rallied to her defense, starting the riot. Police responded with a tough crackdown, which appeared to be successful at first. Instead, it merely grew the crowd larger and more aggressive over time. The riots stopped not because of the police, but because the crowd ran out of steam and dispersed on its own. Historians now regard the Stonewall riots to be the point at which the contemporary LGBTQ movement began to aggressively advocate for their community's concerns. Wall Street is the most recognizable element of the state economy. Investment banking alone is anticipated to contribute for $40 billion of Wall Street earnings. Bankers on Wall Street might make up to $300,000 per year on average. Wall Street alone accounts for 19% of the state government's revenue. All of this has resulted in New York City having the world's largest public equities and debt capital markets. Other important financial services led by Wall Street include hedge funds, private equity, and mergers and acquisitions. It established the city and state as the epicenters of the American banking sector. In addition, the state boasts Silicon Alley and Tech Valley. Silicon Alley isn't so much a location as it is a reference to the state's significant number of high-tech entrepreneurs. Biotechnology, digital media, game designers, software development, and other IT enterprises are examples. Because of its placement as the North American end of numerous transatlantic fiber optic cables, New York City in particular is extremely receptive to the industry. In comparison, there is Tech Valley, which includes the Hudson Valley as well as the surrounding Rensselaer and Saratoga counties. The term stems from the large number of high-tech developers who work in numerous industries there. Digital electronics, nanotechnology, and even microchip manufacture are examples of this. The media business in New York State is strong. In reality, the state is home to North America's largest media market, while New York City has long been known as the world's media hub. CNN, Fox, Hearst, NBC Universal, The New York Times, Thomson Reuters, and many more media conglomerates have their headquarters in the state or city. In New York State, there are over 200 newspapers and 350 magazine publishers. New York State is also home to some of the world's leading advertising firms, like the Omnicom Group and Deloitte General. There are also the world's top 3 record labels, Universal Music Group, Sony Music, and Warner Music Group. BuzzFeed, Vice Media, and Yahoo are among the other prominent media businesses headquartered in New York. The same may be said for its tourism business. In reality, the state maintains a well-organized advertising strategy to attract tourists to New York State. This is the source of the advertising slogan, "I love New York," which applies to both the state and the city of the same name. Today, an estimated 63 million visitors visit New York each year, bringing in an estimated $44 billion for the state. The Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, the One World Trade Center, and the nearby September 11 Memorial are all popular tourist attractions. Broadway is also a famous tourist site, generating an estimated $1 billion in ticket sales alone each year. Many tourists to New York come to see sporting events at Madison Square Gardens. The state's economy relies heavily on export and import. Computers, cut diamonds, electronics, and processed food are the state's principal exports, generating an estimated $71 billion each year. Fur, printed materials, railroad equipment, car parts, and even textiles are key exports. New York City, in particular, is the state's textile and car manufacturing hub. It also serves as the state's primary point of departure for exports to global markets. Canada is the state's largest export market, followed by the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Israel, and China. Aluminum, gold, natural gas, oil, raw diamonds, and wood are among the state's imports. Because its energy industry cannot fulfill all of its demands, the state imports power from neighboring states. The state also boasts an impressive agriculture industry. New York State boasts the third largest grape crop in the United States and a wine industry second only to California. The Finger Lakes, Hudson Valley, Lake Erie shoreline, and even Long Island's North Fork produce the majority of the state's grapes. The wine sector alone employs an estimated 25,000 people and generates an estimated $5 billion per year. Overall, the state is in the top 5 agricultural states in the United States. Apples, cabbages, cherries, dairy, maple syrup, onions, and potatoes are among the state's other important goods. Farms represent 25% of the state's land area, while a thriving fishing sector runs offshore. Clams, flounder, lobster, and squid are among the most abundant catches. New York State has also made solar energy investments. The Long Island Solar Farm, with a capacity of 37 megawatts, is the largest solar farm on the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. The 17 megawatts Enxco Eastern Solar Long Island Solar Project also runs in the region. New York City also intends to construct a second, larger solar farm with a capacity of 50 megawatts. Other state-level plans include for the construction of 22 solar farms with a total capacity of 646 megawatts during the next decade. While the state is interested in generating green energy, they are currently favoring wind over solar. New York State has an excellent transportation infrastructure. The state boasts one of the most comprehensive transportation networks in the world. In fact, New York City's subway alone handles almost 5 million passengers every day. The Northeast Corridor, which connects New York State with Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., is a major railway in the state. There's also the Empire Corridor, which runs from New York City through Buffalo, via Niagara Falls, and on to Toronto, Canada. However, bus companies such as Greyhound Lines, Megabus, and our Bus offer the majority of public intercity transportation. The state is also home to the John F. Kennedy International Airport, which is the busiest in North America. In New York State, the death sentence has a convoluted history. New York became the first state in the United States to eliminate hanging and replace it with the electric chair. The state's last execution took place in 1963, when convicted robber and murderer Eddie Lee Mays was executed. In 1973, the state abolished all capital punishment. This followed a finding by the United States Supreme Court that existing capital penalty methods violated the U.S. Constitution. In 1995, Governor George Pataki modified state processes to put them in conformity with the U.S. Supreme Court's decision. However, in 2004, the New York State Supreme Court determined that the revised procedure violated the state constitution. In 2008, New York State abolished the death sentence at the state level, leaving only convicts in federal detention vulnerable to the execution penalty. The state takes part in a variety of sports. New York State is home to many NFL teams, including the Buffalo Bills, New York Giants, and New York Jets. The state is also home to two of the most well-known Major League Baseball clubs, the New York Yankees and the New York Mets. The New York Mets, in particular, have a well-known losing run in which they have lost more games than they have won. Both players and spectators, however, like this aspect of the squad since it lends them an aura of underdogism. New York State also has NBA teams, the Brooklyn Nets and the New York Knicks. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel, since we will be covering a lot of similar content in the future. Till next time, stay curious.